Hello friends, welcome to the EduSet Network. Today we are going to talk about literary theory in the 20th century, and this lecture of ours is part of our ongoing series on literary theory. For this subject and discussion, we have in the studio Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor, University of Delhi, and his translation of George Lukács' The Theory of the Novel into Hindi was published under the title Upanyas Ka Siddhant in 1981 under Macmillan publication. He has for long been associated with translation workshops organized by institutions such as Sahitya Academy and Jamia Millia Islamia. He is also a poet and theatre person, and he has scripted plays in English and Hindi. These have been staged in the Delhi's Shri Ram Center, and they have also been performed in Delhi slums. So we are very privileged to have you here, sir. We welcome you, and we request you to begin our today's lecture on literary theory in the 20th century.
Thanks, Urushi, and welcome viewers to this very valuable, topic that we'll discuss today. It will make us aware about the thinking processes of the 20th century world citizen, because theory in the 20th century has reached all corners, almost all corners of the world. It might have originated from Europe and America and Soviet Russia, but later it was picked up by the academic centers the world over. And in India also, right from the time theory came on the scene in the, let's say, early 60s, there were Indian responses to it, not merely in the Indian English area, but also in the regional and other languages. And books as old as 1965 would be, if not books, at least articles in journals would be available that discussed, that went into the question of literary theory. And let me just by way of reference inform you viewers that one of the earliest literary theorists in the 20th century, a Frenchman called Ferdinand de Saussure, borrowed some of his ideas and from an old Sanskrit scholar and thinker as old as, I think, more than 2000 years ago. There was a grammarian in India called Panini, and Saussure borrowed a few ideas from Panini and used them for explication of his theory on language in the classroom. In fact, this particular book would have given rise to a different interpretation of philosophy, language, and also literary works, because literary works fundamentally operate in language and communicate through language to the reader. So, and this particular philosopher belonged to the second decade, that is the 1910 onwards, belonged to the second decade of the 20th century. And interestingly, he never published his work. In fact, he didn't write the book that is ascribed to his name. It is said that he was just teaching language theory to the classroom, to the students in the classroom, and there some people, and he didn't allow students to take notes of what he was saying in the classroom. But some students, out of respect and regard and the relevance of his thoughts, on the sly took down notes, and later on these notes were published. And it is that book that one refers to when talks about literary theory. This is just by way of starting the discussion, but let me tell you that in the 20th century, more work in the English departments has been done on literary theory and the essence of literary criticism, the background of literary criticism, etc. And rightly, the 20th century can be called the century of literary theory. Rightly, I say, because Around the First World War, people started thinking differently of literature, and there was more and more emphasis on language. There was also emphasis in the 20th century early decades on the teaching of literature in the classroom. Now, this point is to be noted because earlier centuries were marked by the interest of the common person who was literate, and before that, the person who was not even literate but went over to watch plays. So there was no gap, there was no kind of bridge between. There was no distance also between literature and the common reader, listener. But in the early 20th century, a kind of distance occurred, and that distance was created by let's say the serious discussion of literature. And this happened because literature was now in the 20th century taught in the classroom, which was never the case earlier. The schools or college curriculums, they would not entertain any idea regarding teaching of literature. Literature was supposed to be sometimes discussed in the journals, and poets themselves or certain other philosophers would take help from literature to elaborate their points. But then it remained in the domain of the larger culture, but never taught in the class. In fact, till the 19th century, the class in the class the teacher would teach language and grammar, and one would go into the intricacies, philosophical in nature of the language and grammar. So grammar means theory, grammar means rules of language that operate at different levels. So that is what was of interest for the serious scholar till the 19th century. But in the 20th century, classroom became important, and there were people who would graduate and do even further study in literature in the classroom. And when it became a subject like this, and it can be also said that the classroom discussions of literature occurred perhaps in India before they occurred in Europe. That is a bit doubtful, but one doesn't know. Maybe this is the case. And I have in mind, the observation of Raymond Williams, who was writing in the 1950s onwards, and he had an essay written in the 1980s where he talked about this fact, that perhaps some of the first discussions on literature in the classroom occurred in the colony called India, the British colony called India. Maybe that is the case, but then it is important that literature, which is supposed to entertain, give pleasure to the listener and the reader, and add to the level of fantasy in the reader. This literature would ever be discussed as a serious subject in the classroom. And I would say that when the classroom teaching and when discussion among professional critics occurs, at that level in different parts of the world and in the academic centers, then literary theory takes off from there, because then you will go further and further into the areas that have so far been assumed as real, but never considered in serious terms. So now teachers and students in the classroom, they will sit together, they will take a text, they will try to analyze the text, they will try to interpret the text, there will be differences of opinion, there will be certain structures of literature that will become apparent to the discussants in the classroom situation. Then there will be magazines and journals which will be devoted entirely to the study of literature and not to literature per se. So this phenomena of the school, the college, the university, the specifically literature-oriented journals, this phenomena occurs in the 20th century, because of which people get jobs in the English departments, in the other in departments in other languages all over the world, and there is a vast majority of scholars that operates in this field. Later on, there are schools of journalism also where literature comes through the back door and all those things. So, rightly, as I said, I repeat, rightly, the 20th century is the century of literary discussion, literary thought, and literary theory. So with this, I'll of course, because today's lecture is supposed to be devoted to the general view of literary criticism, literary theory in the 20th century. So I'll touch upon a few areas that bind all these trends that I'll be talking about together. But before I do that, let me tell you certain distinctive features of the 20th century, because maybe these had something to contribute to the origin and evolution of literary theory. How they contributed, to what extent they went to to influence the writing of discussion on literature, and then a discussion about what went behind the discussion on literature. So that is difficult to establish. But there are certain pointers we have to keep in mind that make the 20th century stand out in historical terms. So I start with, let's say, perhaps the most important, the most influential development in society, politics, and also culture and life in general, which was not the case earlier. There was an event that happened in the 20th century that marked it out as a distinctive one in its own terms, and that is the First World War. This kind of a war had never occurred in human history anywhere. There were different countries participate in the war, and they forget the interests of any particular region. If you asked the participants in the war at that point of time as to what they were fighting for, then they wouldn't have any tangible answer to give. So they would point an accusing finger at each other, saying that that person caused it and that country caused it and all those things. And even today, there's a wide gap between the ordinary citizen in the world and the scholars of history with respect to the war, and that gap has not been filled up yet. So I take this quotation from a historian who has written this famous book called The People's History of the World. There's a gentleman called Chris Harman, and I take this quotation from him. And the quotation goes like this: the First World War caused extreme dislocation in society as a whole. By 1915 and 1916, this is wrongly printed here, by 1915 and 1916, all the contending powers realized they were involved in total war. The outcome depended on directing all national resources towards the battlefront, virtually regardless of the effects on living standards. I go further. Industries producing consumer goods had to be turned over to producing munitions, that is arms and other weapons of destruction. Substitutes had to be found for foodstuffs and raw materials previously imported from enemy countries or subject to naval blockades. These were the changes that occurred during the years of the war. Workers had to be shifted from industry to industry, and fresh supply of labor power found to replace those sent to the front. So this kind of social engineering was happening, where people from their original places of work were shifted to other places of work. And then he goes on to talk about the agricultural workers in the villages. They had to be drafted into armies. They had not been trained to fight in the armies, but the peasants and workers, they were drafted into the armies, even if it caused acute food shortages. In Germany, the winter of 1916 became known as the turnip winter, because no food was available, as the vegetables replaced most other foods. And it's very difficult to eat turnip to assuage one's hunger, because turnip, that is shalgam, is not meant to be eaten raw. So it was called the turnip winter because people didn't have anything else to eat, and therefore because all the food producing industries had been shut down and people didn't know what to eat to survive. It goes further still. Nothing marks, the quotation has ended here, and I have to comment on this now. Is it a passage from history? I ask this question from myself and from you, because there is no reference to any leader, world leader. There is no reference except one to any country who was participating in it. The whole reference, the whole idea is of how the World War affected the life of the ordinary masses. So this is the new kind of history, and I've given already larger discussions on history in the other lectures. Therefore, I leave it here and say that history in the 20th century would be concerned with the conditions of people caused by the circumstance of war. So if war occurs, nobody wins in the war. People in fact lose most of their comforts and conveniences in the war. That serves their interests, and they have nothing to gain. So this kind of a war was fought in the 20th century in the second decade. And he is talking about contending powers. He doesn't name countries, and they realized they were involved in a total war. So which means that people, the contending powers realized later that it was a total war. Well, what does total war mean? And let's see how the historian explains. The outcome depended on directing all national resources towards the battlefront. So whatever you have in the country, whatever we have in the country, that is shifted from the common arena of life to the battlefront, virtually regardless of the effects on living standards. So nobody bothers about how people will survive, how they will live, how they will sustain their culture, how will they sustain sweet relationships and all these things. They are not important. The only important thing, according to the contending powers, those who ruled different countries, their only interest was to take part in war and defeat the mythical enemy, because nobody knew who the enemy was. Then he says industries producing consumer goods had to be turned over to producing munitions. I have already explained it, but then you start producing arms and don't produce food. Don't produce other items of use. And then the further compounding the problem, foodstuffs and raw materials previously imported from enemy countries. Now there are enemy countries, you can't import from there. So or subject to naval blockades, because you don't allow movement of the foodstuffs from one place to another. Workers had to be shifted from industry to industry. So people are trained to work in one factory, but then they are supposed to do to the other. Agricultural workers, already I have told you, this is what the First World War was. And nearer home, India was a participant in the First World War. I think in one of the lectures I touched upon this topic, but I can say in some detail that a large part of the Indian peasantry living in Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh and other parts of the world, this peasantry was trained in fighting, and the youth from the villages, they would be between 20 and 30, so they were recruited from the villages. They were given 10, 15, 20 days or 40 days training in using guns, etc., and then they were shifted to, they were sent to the war front in Europe. So imagine that Indian youth is fighting not for its interests, but fighting for the interests of the colonizer, and the colonizer has to decide. The British colonial power in India, that is to decide where the Indian soldier will go and fight and whom, and this kind of a war. So it's a very horrendous kind of a beginning for a century, where people do not struggle for a cause that they hold dear to their heart and close to their heart, and they simply fight because somebody else is asking them to fight. So this kind of a war, don't you think that this will leave its impact on literature, on writers, on people who feel, who are sentimental, who express happiness, who express doubt and questioning, who believe in some kind of harmony? If that doesn't exist, then they are sad. If that exists, then they write comedies. Now all these people, do you think they will not try to make sense of the devastation that the war caused, and show some kind of a dismay? So this is what may have necessitated a different approach to literature and to culture at that time, and this was looming behind what came to be known in literary theory immediately after this, around this period, called modernism. So this is the kind of modern reality that one talks about in the 20th century. In fact, if you remember, in the earlier lectures, we have discussed early modern writing. That writing belongs to the Renaissance. And in the 20th century, modern phenomena is the phenomena of war, where literature feels helpless to discuss anything, because things are not in their hands at all. and things are not in the hands of the people at large. They are in the hands of what this person called Chris Harman called contending powers, and nobody knows what exactly is the meaning of contending powers. So and this is not the only thing. 20th century only begins with the First World War in 1914. Actually it began, but virtually it might have been there around. The clouds of war would be hovering over the opening years of the 20th century, and finally it rained. If one has to extend the metaphor, the clouds rained bombs, rained all kinds of violence from above, as it were, and from above was not the will of God. It didn't happen at that level, but above meant the people who ruled different countries at that point of time. So this would have given rise to a different kind of thought in the 20th century, and I give one example, that of modernism, and maybe I discuss it later, but straight away I can tell you that this modernism is totally, entirely different from the modernism that we associate with Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, some Fielding in the 18th century, with Dickens in the 19th century. This modernism, where people don't know where they are going, people do not know what they are doing and why they are doing it, etc., where literature doesn't know what to say, because nothing can be said about the contemporary phenomena. Therefore, modernism at that point of time takes its essence from the situation at hand, and that is the sense of helplessness, the unreal situation in which the individual has been placed, and this individual person's angst and his anguish and his concern. All these things become the essence of modernism, where there's a sense of alienation, there's a sense of self-doubt and dismay. This is what modernism in the 20th century stands for, and this has something to do with. And then, of course, one has to understand, modernism with respect to the ideas that work behind it, and in a way, literary theory, in a different sense, begins around this time. I can refer to certain works of literature in English around the First World War, works of literature also in India around the First World War. There is a difference. India is not a direct participant, I told you. England is, Germany is, France is, even America is indirectly involved, and there, modernism sets in, and becomes almost established in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, and all interpretations that are given under the effect of modernism, under the impact of modernism, all those definitions are radically different from the definitions and interpretations existing earlier. For instance, T.S. Eliot writes around the First World War. I think he writes this poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in 1912 or 13, just a couple of years before the First World War, and there, very very shockingly, he describes the evening with a patient etherized on the table, lying unconscious. So can one think of the evening, which is supposed to be the time of the day, when people come back home and they start enjoying themselves, they relax, and people have written lots of poems on evening, that in the 20th century, under the clouds of war, a poet, a major poet of the 20th century, would compare the evening with a patient who is lying unconscious on the table, the operation table. So this kind of a thing, and that showed, to the writer that nothing at all was possible. So in Eliot and in other poets of modernism in the 20th century, if there is some sense of disgust for the entire development that happened since the Renaissance, it is to some extent understandable. Of course, that there are forces, I would not bring in at that point at this moment. There are forces in Europe around the same time that are asserting themselves and bringing in a new era, a new dawn. I'll not go into that, except that Soviet Russia also is some kind of an outcome of the First World War, and in the 1917 it emerges as a socialist power for the first time. But then I leave that aside and say that if modernism has its roots in roots in the formation of the World War and the actual reality of the First World War, then of course things have changed drastically in the early 20th century. There is a quotation that I have taken from a book. The book was published in the latter part of the 20th century, but then it refers to the kind of break that I am suggesting between the 19th century and the 20th century. And then I go to the quotation here to try to understand as to how things are happening on the plane of literature and on the plane of literary thought. He says this person called Annan, his name is Noel Annan, and he says that nothing marks the break with Victorian thought more decisively than modern sociology. So a new discipline emerges in writing at that point of time, and in academics. This is called sociology. This discipline never existed. There were books on history, but nobody talked about sociology. So that break with Victorian thought occurs more decisively than modern sociology, and that revolution at the beginning of this century, which we associate with the names of Weber, Durkheim, and Pareto. These are the philosophers of sociology, the founding scholars of sociology. They no longer started with the individual as the central concept in terms of which society must be explained. So imagine the individual loses one's dignity at that point of time. It will no more be discussed in terms of one's individuality. It will be discussed as some kind of a symbol of or some kind of a carrier of the larger interests. So they no longer, this is not the individual is not there at that point of time as the central concept, and society will be explained in other terms. Maybe there are certain forces that sociology will discuss, certain trends that sociology will discuss. Maybe the biggest trend of the 20th century would then be violence. So if you discuss violence, then you start talking in sociological terms, and you never refer to an individual person, his or her life, his or her predicament, all those things that 19th century was interested in, as I have explained earlier. They means the sociologists saw society as a nexus of groups, and the pattern of behavior which these groups unwittingly established primarily determined men's actions. Now, it's very interesting that these groups are being discussed to explain the nature of society, but these groups are operating unwittingly. Imagine that the behavior of these groups unwittingly established primarily determined men's actions. So men's actions, men behave, men conduct themselves, but then they also unknowingly behave, which means that human beings are not aware of the forces that are working on them, and unwittingly the men's actions are determined by the behavior of the groups, and the groups also may have borrowed these particular tendencies that sway them from certain hidden quarters, and because they are hidden quarters, therefore sociology will discuss that point of view. So if sociology becomes a discipline for the scholars, a new discipline that has emerged, don't you think that this new discipline of thought, it's different from philosophy, it's different from morality, it's different from literary criticism, it has a nature of its own. So don't you think that this discipline is going to somehow influence the working of literary criticism at that point of time? I just get some kind of I want to get some kind of support from Urvashi for telling me whether this kind of point that sociology will now determine the discussions of literature also. Is that fear a real fear in the early 20th century, or is one only apprehending something that may or may not happen?
So perhaps it could be a result of the circumstances. Say you mentioned that the First World War and then the fears and the insecurities associated with that. So perhaps as a result of all these factors and modernism being developed and helplessness being characteristic of the period. Perhaps it was because of that sociology became a discipline, different from philosophy, to talk about the society and also for the scholars. But I don't know, sir. If that is correct.
No, that's absolutely correct. But you know that begs another question. The question is whether today literature, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, that today literature is a realm of art, or is it a realm of sociology? Is it a social science, or is it humanities? This question, what do you say regarding this?
Sir, I think it is a realm of humanities, but of course then there's that interdisciplinary nature where
Yes.
it takes on from a lot many disciplines, say sociology and political science or any other discipline. So there's an intermingling. So perhaps we could not put it into a box, but there's a constant interchange.
Absolutely, I think this is the correct way in which literature is to be approached. So there is an element, as you rightly say, apart from the disciplines from other areas. There is an influence that is coming from sociology also, and in serious discussions about society and culture, literary books are being quoted today in the name of interdisciplinarity or otherwise.
Yes.
You see, that in fact in the previous lecture we discussed that Balzac was supposed to be telling more of history in his novels than the historical books.
Right.
So maybe literature of the 20th century tells more about the situation prevailing in the 20th century than some of the academic books, including sociology.
Right.
So that way these people also borrow. So it's absolutely correct that interdisciplinarity actually is a move in the direction where social sciences will also borrow from literature and vice versa.
Right.
So literature will talk about society, and sociology, books of sociology, they will get their insights from literature. And this is actually happening, and this might affect the thinking about literature and thinking about other areas of the mind. So then from here I refer to the point which I already touched upon, that is the linguistics that have have a new light to share in the world of 20th century. And I am quoting now from Ferdinand de Saussure, the person to whom I referred, the French philosopher who never wrote the book, who only did classroom discussions. So I read this particular quotation from it. It's a short one this time. Linguistics works in the borderland where the element of sound and thought combine. So what is language? Language so far has been thought of as the medium of communication, and from there the words begin, and phrases occur, and sentences are exchanged, and paragraphs and essays and large books are written. So and there are dictionaries to support the cause of the books at different points of time. But this person is discussing language not from that angle, not from the given thing called the letter and the word and so forth. He says that literature works in the borderland where the elements of sound and thought combine. So sound is important in literature. It's not words. It's just vowels, and vowels are sounds. And in old traditional grammar books, the vowel has its ending immediately as the word begins, or as the letter, the other letter begins. Where the sound is different. But then here it remains a sound, and there is a sound thought kind of a combine, as he says. Their combination produces a form, not a substance. Once again, when you call a table, you don't talk about substance table, you call about the concept of the table. So the substance means that there is an actual thing that you are talking about, which is not the case. When you speak a language, when you use the medium of language, then in fact you are sharing a sound pattern with other people, and that sound pattern has no materiality about it. So a table is not a table, the glass is not a glass, water is not water, fire is not fire. All these things are sound patterns, and that they also have some connection with the real things is only human made. So the same sound could have denoted, or can denote even today, something else in the context. So there is no substance in language. This is a question of form only, that human beings communicate using a form. So language is a form, not substance. Then actually values remain entirely relative. So nothing is fixed. The whole thing is relative. So values remain entirely relative, and that's why the bond between the sound and the idea is radically arbitrary. This is the point he's making, and it's a seminal point. The point is that whatever you or I signify through a word, try to communicate through a word, actually is arbitrary. Arbitrary means, you know, that I decided, you decided, the human agent decides, the participant in social action decides. Otherwise, the sound pattern itself is a human-made thing. So this is a very radical concept, a very revolutionary concept, and that changed the entire area of human thought in the 20th century. So you will find that this point will be taken up in the classroom now, as to how come that, you know, literature appeals to us, which is only a sound pattern. So people will start discussing now words differently. They'll start, you know, sound patterns differently. They will talk about ironies now. They'll talk about gaps and silences between sounds. Silence is not language, but maybe between two words, when silence occurs, silence also is, gets some kind of being rubbed off by the adjoining words before and after. So all these things in literature and in literary representation will be now discussed from a different angle. So this person lays the foundation of a new kind of linguistics and a new kind of thinking on language that will refer to language as an arbitrary activity, not an activity, you know, which takes its lessons from some other area. And when this happens, then you start saying that the origin of the word actually is the sound, or the origin of the sound is the human conduct. Now this goes completely contrary to the established beliefs that the sound comes from a power called God. For instance, when the world is created, we hear when the world is created, in the beginning is the word. But no, the word is not there in the beginning. The word occurs because human beings utter the word. So it's a very secular kind of a thought. It's a thought, you know, that later on will get established, and all human activity will be the arbitrary activity of human beings, conscious human beings, and this lays the foundation of language, and through language of literary thought. So I just wanted to acquaint you. I'll take it up in detail in one of the lectures later. But then today I say that with the language, at that point of time, a new idea emerges, and this idea is of theory, the theory of language. So very soon you are going to have the theory of literature also, the literary theory, the concern, you know, that we have with our interests at the present moment. Then I move to structural linguistics, which is itself, Ferdinand Saussure and his disciples, who will be active in the field of thought. Literature is a subject of study in the classroom. This I already discussed. Then rise of academicism. And once again, the classroom is the university, the school, the areas of education. They are the academic people, and they communicate among themselves. They discuss things with one another, and they create. They construct. They produce ideas. They produce concepts. They have newer methods of expression and all those things. So that is the rise of academicism. Now it is good, it is bad. It is good because there will be an expert kind of a study of the phenomena that we have been assuming as given earlier. But now we will start doubting their existing credentials, and we will give the new credentials later as to how academic discussion actually should make sense or should not make sense. So research in the sources of writing, this will happen now. You have not merely in the Western universities, but even in Indian universities, you have departments which conduct research, and the research is valued higher than teaching in the lower classes. And in India, Indian universities, research happens after MA, and there is a new now, rung in the ladder called MPhil. After the MPhil, you are somewhat closer to the research activity, and later on, you take up literary texts and write whole books and a whole argument, and that argument has to be different from what has been done earlier. That is called research. Research means that all available things have been exhausted, and then from there you take off and make a new point. And when you substantiate that new point and establish it to the satisfaction of examiners, which means that the senior scholars, then only you are awarded a research degree. Now, this is a new consideration of studying literature. So, in literature, on literature, now there are projects which are research projects, and that these are pursued very, very expertly, in departments of languages and literatures the world over, and also in India. So, research activity is important. So, who is reading literature these days? A good question, of course. Now, there are two kinds of literature. One literature, the popular literature that you and I read in our spare time, and there is serious literature, serious within quotes, which is supposed to be studied. I don't know whether this kind of a division of the category is very good for the study or for the pursuance of literature. But then this is how people these days divide literature into two parts: serious literature, popular literature. What do you say?
Yes, sir, definitely. That is truly the case, and a lot of writing then tells us that this is high kind of literature, high literature, canonical literature, and this is popular literature, literature that can be easily accessible, easily read by the masses is then popular. And
so, which means that the person who took interest in literature has been expelled from the domain of serious literature. Would you say that?
Yes, I would agree with that, sir.
Because now we as ordinary readers have no claim on the study of literature, because that is to be done by the academe, yes, by the academic scholar in the classroom, in the research department. So he will write a book, he or she will write a book, and then will become an established scholar in passage of time. But then the serious literature will remain confined to the scholar. And there are other pressures on the scholar. The scholar has to get a job. The scholar has to keep his own bosses happy, and he'll never come to the genuine point. He will make the point that is acceptable to the majority of the scholars at that point of time. So research also will get affected by the larger areas of culture. So this is the kind of problem that we are surrounded by, and in them we have to pursue the study of literature as the theory of literature, as the meaning in literature, as the use of words, as the use of language. So all these things will come in some way or the other to interest us, or to be accepted by us under certain kind of pressures. So against this background, we are now discussing in the 20th century what is called literary theory. The first step towards literary theory would be done in the 1920s, and there is an area that is developing now, and that area is called practical criticism. In fact, this is the title of one of the books of I. Richards. He called it, and this person started propounding the idea about literature, the theory about literature, that literature doesn't belong to the writer. The literature belongs to the reader, to the student of literature, and therefore I. Richards, when he taught classes, then he would carry pages of writing, and he would get them typed, and then the name of the author would be missing on the page, and he would distribute the papers in the class, and there he would ask them their responses, and whatever responses they expressed in the class, on that basis the understanding of literature was evolved. This is how we tried to explain the literary passage in the classroom, that okay, now this passage is available, it is in front of you, now try to make sense of it and tell me what you mean, and tell others what you mean by this. Then only you will understand literature properly, because you will not referring to any other source but the literature itself that is there in front of you. So that is what practical criticism as a book and as a new approach to literature, which is not author centered, which is not time centered, but which is present before us as a cluster of words, on the page. That is what literature is. And this is one of the first principles of literary theory. Literature is a cluster, a combination of words in a sequence, and that this has to be deciphered by us through codes, through the understanding of codes, and I. Richards very clearly talks about it in his first lessons in the classroom. So your take on this once again, that now literature will be taught differently than before.
So it is definitely a different idea that an author's work is to be not interpreted looking at the author's circumstances or what the author is trying to say, but trying to deduce one's own views by reading the author's words, say the author's book, and basically literature belongs to the reader and not to the author. That once the work of art or work of say a book is produced, then it is ultimately up to the reader to interpret it according to themselves.
And where will the reader get the help to get the message of the text, if at all there is a message? The help will come, as you would have suggested through your answer, would come from words only.
Would come from words.
And words and their combinations, and their placement on the page. You know, all those things. So one is going into the domain of philosophy, into the domain of course actual study, where you are interpreting the word in its association with the word before and the word after, and the placement it enjoys within the structure of the sentence,
right.
And then from words to the sentences, and from sentences to paragraphs. So this is the new method, and which means that one is ousting, one is expelling the presence of the author from the scene, as you rightly say, that what is important is the page on the word, and this is the basic principle of new criticism that will soon emerge after this. So new criticism will step in the 20th century towards the closing years of the third decade, that is 1920s. So new criticism comes into being, and new criticism has its source both in the British universities and the American universities. And from now onwards, Dickens would be seen as a text, Milton will be seen as a text, other people also will be seen as texts, not as authors. So and they have to say nothing. They only say that much that the reader understands from one's own experiences. So this is the crux of new criticism, and new criticism becomes quite popular there in the 20th century. In fact, this next word that I refer to is neo-Aristotelianism. So what they understand by, the 20th century critics understand by Aristotle is not the personality of Aristotle and the place in history that he occupied. Aristotle is understood in terms of the effect, because Aristotle said, in his extant text, it's not a full text that we have available of Aristotle, and there he talks about the tragic play, the tragedy, the drama. So if it is tragedy, then it's an expression of suffering, it's an expression of fear and all those things. So which means that the fear and the suffering, they are important, not the author. And Aristotle has said somewhere that in the same text, of course, that plot is more important than character. So people will not discuss now characters, they will discuss plot. Plot means the structure of the novel or the structure of the poem. So these I call it neo-Aristotelianism. This is how it is termed, in an academic area. So this Aristotelianism has nothing to do with Aristotle. Aristotle would have said all these things, but then he was not presenting them as a concept. He was talking about certain books which are not available to humankind today. So he had them in mind, and he was explaining a specific point there. But then these 20th century universities, they took this idea from there and they reduced it to what is called new criticism. So according to them, Aristotle can be used for establishment of the credentials of new criticism in the 20th century. So this is another point that occurred in the first half of the 20th century. Then in theatres particularly, the naturalist, I have not discussed it earlier, but there is no time today. I'll maybe take it up at some other time. There was a naturalistic theatre in the 20th century, which was the 1920s or so, and naturalistic theatre meant the theatre of the life as it appears to us in reality. That is called naturalistic theatre. So if you are presenting the life in a drawing room in the evening in a bourgeois home, in a middle class home, then it should look like a room on the stage. That is called realistic theatre. If a character speaks a particular dialogue, then that dialogue should be exactly the way the character would speak in that situation in life. So this is naturalist theatre, and there is a whole theory behind it, which we will discuss later at length in some other lecture. We had in the 20th century epic theatre. Epic theatre would not bother about naturalistic details, the real details. Epic theatre will be guided by an overall emotion of heroism, because epics mean the expression of the heroic experience. And in the 20th century, the heroic experience is important, and we can be, rightly asking as to what is heroic about the 20th century, because as I said in the First World War, there was no heroism at all, and well, the answer will be given by the person who propounded the idea of epic theatre, that in the modern times there are no heroes of the kind that existed in the ancient period, but there are new heroes, and these heroes are the masses. So that way, epic theatre will emphasize the importance of the masses as heroes in the 20th century. This is another theory. There is a theory, and that occurs, that takes its idea from the experience of the Second World War, which occurred in less than 30 years of the First World War, 32 years, within 32 years of the First World War. In 1939, the Second World War started. This was much more devastating. This was much more dismay-producing happening, and then people lost all faith in language, assertion of intervention in society, assertion of values in society, and they termed all that was expressed by human beings in specific situations or general situations as absurd. And this reigned supreme for 2 or 3 decades in English literature, European literature, and its effect was felt by the rest of the world also. So there was a theory, and the theory was that in the 20th century, nothing positive, valuable is possible, and each thing is as bad or as good as the other. Then modernism I have discussed. This is there in the 20th century. Existentialism is close to modernism, but its parameters are somewhat different. I'll talk about them at some other time. Then there is formalism. There was a kind of form that Ferdinand de Saussure talked about, and in literary realm, we had certain thinkers who talked of literature as form. So when a novel would be discussed, then a novel will be discussed in the context of different characters interacting with one another, different incidents leaving their effect on one another, and that one would always confine oneself to the world of the novel, and there one will talk about the form, the aesthetic form, the form that gave continuity or some kind of a character to the novel or the poem, and then once the final resolution in the circle of the text has been reached, then the discussion will end and conclusion of some kind will happen. That is formalism. Structuralism and post-structuralism, in that the critics will discuss from this angle that world works through structures. If you remember, when we were discussing in the 19th century context the Marxist idea of base and superstructure, then the base was also supposed to be structure. So imagine in the 20th century, the literary theorist will take the concept of structure to a new level, and will discuss literary texts as structured, and as allowing smaller structures to work within the larger structure. And then of course more scholars will come forward. They will go into the weaknesses of structuralism, limitations of structuralism, and then they will say, okay, we are structuralists, but we have learned our lessons, therefore we call ourselves post-structuralists. So this is called post-structuralism. that structuralism will be raised to a new level, and from there whatever emerges will be applied to a literary text. Then there is another very important trend of literary theory called Orientalism. Now, what is Orientalism? Orientalism means the idea that tells us that East is different from the West, and that this is East and that is West. So, the philosopher, the literary theorist here will tell us as to how Orient actually is a construct of the West. It is the in the jargon, in the critical jargon, it is the other of the West. So, the West will decide what is East. So this idea will be discussed there, and for instance, if Indian literature is to be interpreted, then who will tell us what is Indian literature? The Western scholar, because he has or she has an idea of the Eastern experience, and that experience will determine what the Oriental thing means. So that is a kind of ism. Then there will be re-emergence of historicism, which was kind of Marxism in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and areas that were determined, dominated or influenced by the Russian experience. So they were the historicist areas in criticism, but then they might have had lapses somewhere or the other, and with that, people will try to correct those lapses and learn lessons and call it new historicism. So they will extend the scope of historicism to cover that which is not tangibly historical. Cultural materialism, I put them together because they mean the same thing. In England, this is called cultural materialism, and in America it is called new historicism. But they mean the same thing, that historicism or materialism has to be extended further. So then the last point I conclude here: feminism, psycholinguistics, post-colonialism. These will be all seen in the 20th century, and with this I end and say that the scope is really wide, and we require a number of sessions to understand what went on in the name of literary theory in the 20th century.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for the very lucid presentation, for the very interesting presentation. And as sir mentioned, we would require separate lectures to talk about the different schools of literary theory. So we still have to talk about the ones that sir mentioned today, and we would be planning these lectures, and we would keep you informed as well. So as we draw to the close of the lecture, I'd like to thank sir for being here and sparing his valuable time, and also thank you listeners. So keep watching us, and we would also appreciate more questions and feedback. So again, thank you and have a nice day.